So good afternoon, boa tarde, welcome, bem-vindos e bem-vindas to this exciting event, Brazil is Back, in which we intend to dwell in the question that Beto will keep us on the cliffhanger until the end, can Lula save the Amazon? He will start with the Brazilian Amazon paradox, but the underlying question here is the political question. Can Lula save the Amazon? My name is João Biel. I'm the chair of the Department of Anthropology and also director of the Brazil Lab here at the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. We are delighted to organize this event together with the Department of Anthropology, the High Meadows Environmental Institute, the Program in Latin American Studies, and the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. Right after a historical election, in his COP27 appearance last November, the Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva pledged to reduce deforestation in the Amazon to zero. At the time, taking over with plans for Brazil to become a green superpower, he vehemently stated, Brazil is back in the fight against global warming. Since then, much has been announced. In his first decision as a president, Lula restored the authority of the government's Environmental Protection Agency, IBAMA, to combat illegal deforestation. He also created a new ministry for indigenous peoples, unfroze the Amazon Fund, and appointed a dream team to key environmental posts, including Marina Silva. In the meantime, the Yanomami humanitarian crisis loomed in the horizon. To help us probe the future of the Amazonian vital planetary nexus, we have with us today two great friends of the Brazil Lab. Beto Veríssimo is senior researcher at Amazon, a think and do tank based in the Brazilian Amazon that he co-founded in 1990. A Brazil Lab affiliate scholar, Beto is currently leading the project Amazônia 2030, which explores conservation and socioeconomic leapfrogging initiatives for the region. He was trained in agricultural engineering at the Federal Rural University of the Brazilian Amazon and earned a master in ecology at Penn State. Over the past decades, Beto has developed multiple strategies and partnerships to reduce the level of deforestation and degradation of the Brazilian Amazon. One of Brazil's most influential environmental leaders, Beto has received numerous international honors, including the Skoll Foundation Award for Social Entrepreneurship. Matias Spector, the discussant of today's session, is professor at the School of International Relations at Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Brazil. He has published extensively on North-South politics and international security, and is currently developing a research program on climate politics in the Global South. Matias holds a doctorate from Oxford University and is a visiting scholar at the Reimagining World Order program here at Pierce at Princeton, together with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So wonderful, Beto, to have you back to your home in the US, Princeton. Matias, great to have you here. The format for today, Beto Veríssimo will speak for about 25 minutes on the Brazilian Amazon paradox, leading to the question, can Lula save the Amazon? And for about 25 minutes, and after that, Matias will offer a brief comment and a question or two to kick off the discussion. So Beto will reply and we'll open up to conversation with you all. So let's again welcome Beto back to Princeton with our warmest welcome.
Thanks, João. Thanks for the introduction. It's nice to be back. We have 2019, 2021, two interesting seminars here, the leapfrogging, so the idea how to actually to address key issues that facing the Amazon. I think recently I have the idea here at the end of the conversation here, I'm going to hope I can address the question. It's a provocative question that João raised about can Lula save the Amazon? And I think as I decide to do a presentation a little bit different and less on economics, more on the environment, to try to address the question that you raise. So we have been working the Amazonia 2030 initiative. It's about almost 100 researchers from different fields and top scientists in Brazil, some here as well, collaborators in the US. So I summarize the findings that relate to the question of how Lula, it's possible to Lula to save the Amazon. So first of all, I think that just to understand that we are talking about a region that's very big. How big it is the size of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Myanmar. Okay, that's the Brazilian Amazonia. Different from those countries that I mentioned, with the population is about 2 billion people. Here, we have just 28 million people. So size matter, population pressure doesn't matter here, okay? Just compared to the size of population of the country that I mentioned, here it's about 1%, less than 2%. So the issues in the Amazon does not relate to demographic pressure. There are other issues that actually drive deforestation. Here it's a very simple way to think about the Amazon regions. This is a map that one analysis that we did. It's a combination of countings. So we got the green areas is the counties in the Amazon region where forest cover is more than 90%. So it's what we call Amazon forest territories, more covered by forest. You get the yellow, there's still a lot of forest, but it's under pressure. There's a lot of deforestation and illegal logging and land grabbers. All these problems are in the yellow part. The red zone is the area that we lost forest, we call. We still have forest there, but the majority of the territory, 70%, is already clear cut. Then you have the gray zone that called Cerrado, the savannas. It's important because people make confusions about, like say, agricultural performance in the Cerrado is good, and people try to translate it. The same for the rest of the colors, where the biome of mostly originally covered by forest, and you see complete different results. This mistake has been done by federal government over the last 40 years. So it's a lot of, let's say, policy that has been designed to implement, let's say, infrastructure or livestock production, agriculture, that extrapolate from the Cerrado to the Amazonia, where originally were forest cover. And the black points is the cities. And 76% of the people live in cities. So cities is key if you think about the question that we are going to address. So just to give it, because I'm going to go back in some points, I'm going to make comments about this 5 Amazonia. It's more than that, but it just as a way to summarize the complexity. The paradox is that we have 3 major issues that I try to briefly address here. One, we deforest a lot and more than we need. We deforest an area the size of Spain and Italy combined in just 4 decades. Most of the land, 2/3 of the land, is either degraded or using in a very, very, very low agricultural productivity. And means, where it means very, very, very low. Livestock productivity average, and in agriculture terms, it should be a 1,000 kilo per hectare per year. And the Amazon is less than 100. So it's 10 times, 15 times less than used to be the average of livestock productivity. So that's mean we deforest a lot, more than we needed, and we still deforest. And there is no reason for the forest, apart that I'm going to talk about a little bit the question of land grabbing. So the second, of course, there's a lot of emissions associated with deforestation. And the greenhouse emissions coming from Brazil is top 5, top 7 emitters of greenhouse emissions, mostly because of the deforestation. The last 5 years, deforestation in the Amazon contributes for about 50% of the country's emissions. And GDP contribution from Brazil, from the Brazilian Amazon, is less than 9%. So you get very, very low level of economic performance for a very, very high level of emissions. If Brazilian Amazon was a country, was a very strange country because emitted a lot and generate very low level of revenue. There was actually a graphic that we did in another work. That's a big outlier. It's like a Qatar. The difference is we don't have the wealth of Qatar. We emit a lot, but with very few economic opportunities. So that's the element of the paradox. And the third element is, although the population is relatively small, compared to what I mentioned about the sub-Indian continent, there is a lot of complete demographic dynamics in the Amazon region. Brazil is getting old. The rest of Brazil is getting older. The Amazon is very youth people. It's more actually, in some aspects, relate to Africa than from the rest of Brazil. So Amazonia region is 20 years behind Brazil in the transition of our demographics. It means we have a lot of young folks looking for opportunities. They don't find opportunities because the economy that I mentioned is actually very fed in illegality and criminality. So it's hard to do business in the region. So that's the paradox. And the solutions, just to go back, the solutions that we get deforestation too much, that we have a plenty of lands for forest restoration, for example. We can work in carbon sequestration. So there is one area in Brazilian Amazon available for do forest restorations the size of Germany, 37 million hectares. Okay, if we need nature-based solutions as a transition. My perspective is that the technological approach for carbon capture, if it works, you're going to take time. Meanwhile, we need nature, and we need the Amazonia. So Amazonia is critical. And the land that's available here, it's part of the solution. So that's the paradox. We have the problem, we have the solutions. Emissions is going to the same direction, because as you plant the trees, you capture carbon, and young folks, if you have a lot of people that are out of the job that is young, have the potential to use those young folks for generate development. So that's the way we try to address the issue. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but there's a lot of reasons why we have to end deforestation. First, of course, is inefficient, is unnecessary, as I mentioned. Second, the forest standing for has increasing value, both in terms of economic service. Carbon is probably the first one, but that more than that, biodiversity, and also in terms of culture, because there's more than 200 indigenous people that actually depends or live with the forest. So there's a lot of reasons why we should keep forests standing. Deforestation contributes to a lot of loss for Brazilian society in terms of land grabbing, corruptions, criminality. There's a lot of things related that Brazil should stand. And I think that's one reason. As I mentioned, deforestation actually promotes a lot of illegality. And in a sense, deforestation is an issue of an economics, because in effect, it creates obstacles for investment, for development. And the final point is Brazil's reputation in terms of trade, international trade, is really affected by deforestation. Brazil has now an advanced agreement with the European Union for market to have a combination of Brazil and Europeans. The agreement was basically frozen because the deforestation out of control. Again, it's just one number here. People can jump a lot of numbers, but this is an analysis about if Brazil. This is deforestation moving up here, the black, 21, we got, this is a projection if you can go back to the level you have in the past. Deforestation moving back, moving down. Not zero, but getting very strong reduction, probably 80%. It generates opportunity for $18 billion if you consider the price of carbon of $10 per ton. That's pretty low level of price. Of course, there's a lot of mechanism how to going to use this fund but I'm just to mention that that's a value there. I mentioned about the demographic dividend here, just to understand the Brazilian Amazon population, young folks here. Back here, we are going to have the best decade for demographic dividend is now, up to 2030. Brazil is back. It's old. It was 20 years ago. So this is about 20 years difference in terms of demographic. Understand demographics really open a mind for us in terms of opportunities. Again, just look at how the labor markets actually operates in the regions. It's bad performance because you get a lot of folks, 29% is out of the labor market. You got it here in the United States, 3% of the unemployment rate. It's 29% here. In Brazil, the rest is it's 18%. It includes people that are out of work and people are not looking for a job. So we get this, we deforest a lot, and this deforestation create a lot of emissions, and they are not provide even a decent work for most of people, especially the young folks. Here, another element to understand the issue here, Brazil Amazon has only 9% of the young people with training at level of secondary level or high school level of training. The rest of Brazil is a 16%, the OECD country is 44%. So it's the issue of youth people, it's critical. And to find solutions for the Amazon, you have to address and include in the perspective how we are going to deal with the young folks. So the issue is Brazil knows how to reduce deforestation. We did in the past. This is back 2004. We got an area bigger than Belgium clear-cut per year. And then with Lula won, the first term as Lula president, and Marina Silva in place, we got a reduction of 84%. How we did this? Technology, using for enforcement, address the land grabbing issue, and that was something that we learned from the past that we can do again with some innovation that I'm going to explain a little bit. We did this deforestation in the past, so you're moving down. That was actually from this period to this period, we reduced about 4 gigatons of emissions. If you keep business as usual in the past, as we saved in terms of emission about 4 gigatons. And probably one of the most important achievements of humankind in terms of CO2 emissions, the reduction of deforestation. At the same time, the GDP for agriculture has moving up. So it's pretty clear that those two graphics, that we don't need to clear cut for increased agricultural productivity and then GDP performance. Again, we look at what the people are, because there are some politicians in Brazil who say, oh, we need some level of deforestation because we need to create jobs. And deforestation is the forestry create jobs. The data show complete different picture. 83% of the jobs that are actually in the cities, they are not connected with deforestation. And so only 17 is actually in the rural area, and mostly are not actually connected with deforestation. So the gold miners, the illegal loggers, although they represent the picture of a lot of people, when you put this in the scale of the Amazon, it's a very small proportion. So deforestation does not actually create jobs, does not create development. So this is the data that show very clear. As I mentioned, most of the jobs and opportunities are in the cities. It tells a little bit about that maybe, that's a question, there is a concept, very interesting concept by Arminio Fraga. A lot of people know him. He was, I think, a member of Princeton trustee or board. He's a famous economist in Brazil. He was this idea of Amazon, it's an island economy. In a sense, maybe you would develop the cities and left the forest alone. I mean, just don't put too much pressure on the forest. just the forests provide the service they provide for the planet in terms of ecosystem service, biodiversity conservation. Don't push too much pressure onto extracted product from the forest. It's just because we can actually handling the economy, just looking at improving the cities. So that's just it's a provocative way to look at. We did this in the past. Lessons learned. We using satellite images for command and control. We talked before here. I give a presentation with more details about this. We use financial incentives to environmental regularity. We frozen credit for people that did deforestation. So we learned in the past, and we use protected, increased protected areas. Brazil did in between 2004 and 2006, create an area of conservation units. I'm not talking about indigenous land, just conservation units bigger than France. That's compare what Ted Roosevelt did back to the early 20th century US. We create a national, we expand the national forests, the parks, and all the protected areas. That was an element, it was important for biodiversity, but it was important to fight deforestation. Because when you create a protected area, you basically remove the incentive to land grabbing to go to the forest. If the forest is not protected, the land grabbing kind of operation mine goes to this area. So when we created, we've frozen the area for, that was the reason why the deforestation moving so dramatically. So relative low cost and very effective system to address deforestation. Of course, we need new tools now. We're going to, as João mentioned about the environmental capacity. Now IBAMA is back. That's not only Brazil is back. IBAMA is back. It's back to take care of the forest that has been grabbing, has been invaded. Of course, there's be a tough moments ahead. Of course, the legal system is still operating there. There's going to be what we call, there's still a lot of remain forests to be protected. And again, the numbers is kind of amazing, but there is another area. I take France as an example again. There's one area, size of France, inside the Amazon region, with forests that not yet protected and should be protected. And Lula mentioned this with Marina during the COP in Egypt. He said, we are going to protect those lands. This is what it's called no designated public forest. We need to do this because if the forest is still open for grabs, it's difficult to save the Amazon. So to save the Amazon, we need to complete the job that we started 20 years ago to demarcate indigenous lands and conservation units as soon as possible. The elements of financial, let's say, mechanism of enforce, avoid the credit goes to illegality is important. We have a very interesting work here with the people from the central bank in Brazil. Really try to enforce the way it's easy today to stop financial transaction with illegality if people want to do. It's possible. And I think this is a very powerful instrument. It might be another presentation just to go into detail about this. But I mentioned that's something that's coming now. New and secondary vegetation. I mentioned secondary vegetation because 21% of the Amazonia has been deforested. Part of this area is coming back. The 81% that's covered by forests are not completely in good shape. There are some areas has been affected by forest fires and logging. And we need to monitor a little bit this area, both in terms of what's coming back, what is covered by forest, but it's still in some way affected by illegal logging and forest fire. That systems now we already have developed. And people like Tasso has been talking about this. We have a wonderful system in Brazil, both at the federal level, at the government level, of monitoring deforestation almost in real-time fashion. And we have the civil society groups like Amazon and Map Biomas doing a lot of using satellite images to cover everything. We can detect gold mining, illegal logging, roads, and the secondary vegetation and the forest degradation are elements of the problem, the puzzle that we have to address. The organized crime is something that happened very strongly recently. It's a new element of the problem. It was not so present the first time that Lula was in government. The question of traceability of production chain, that improves a lot. So we will be able to detect if you buy timber from the Amazonian region or soybean or meat or whatever you want, is coming from illegal or not, come from deforestation or not. That's possible. Technically speaking, it's possible. Rural settlement, the few people knows about, but this is a huge, more than 600 polygons of rural settlements in the Amazon region. The size, German. And the level of deforestation is very high inside of this territory. They brought people there with social reasons, but there was no alternative for actually to have a sustainable land reform settlements most of the Amazon. So we have to address this. And as I mentioned, the forest degradation aspect. And this is more like the system of Brazil. Brazil has a very famous system of health that was very important to fight COVID. And we need to do the same for the environment. It means we have to create systems that can be stabilized when the bad government is coming. Because in some moment, bad governments can come back. And what Amazonia was not destroyed by Bolsonaro because there was institutions that actually stand up. And we need to strengthen the national environmental system. The mention that I mentioned that the challenge that we have in front is this is analysis that show the homicide rates in the Amazon region. If I Trish lives in the Amazon, the time that the criminality in the Amazon was below Brazil. Brazil is in this analysis, it's the yellow line here. So, but 2005, that's moving up and doesn't stop. If the Brazilian Amazon was a country, excluding countries that are in a war, there will be top 5, more like El Salvador and other countries. Some parts of the Amazon is actually very now occupied by drugs cartel and other elements. So that's the new challenge that we don't have in the past. Of course, they are not widespread. We know exactly what they are, but that's something new. When I mentioned about the 5 Amazonias, it's a simple exercise, but that's when you look at policy, you have to think about policy. They are going to be different. Here in the Amazonia was very low level of deforestation. We have to consolidate. There's a lot of protected area, but there's still a lot of space here to create new protected areas. So both they create new protected, avoid any kind of infrastructure that's being roads and all this stuff, because when you open road, you actually invite for deforestation. We need another type of infrastructure here that probably internet and more the river transportation network. That is the largest water basin in the planet. The good news is 95% is navigable. That we can now have a systems of infrastructure. The infrastructure is there. It's nature-based infrastructure. For example, only 13% of the Brazilian Amazon has broadband internet. The rest of Brazil is 53%. So infrastructure means expand broadband internet. That's the infrastructure that we have to talk about. That's part of challenge now, because those people are going to ask about infrastructure, accessibility. The answer is not road, the answer is internet, especially in those more remote areas. Here is on the red zone, I mean the war zone here. Have to fight deforestation, forest degradation. There's a lot of, and still is place to create protected area. A lot of illegal grabbing. Grabbing, it's a problem. Maybe it's hard for Americans, but you guys had this problem in the past, 100 years ago, but you solve it. We need to solve it here because there's still a lot of things uncertain about land tenure. Gold mining here, but it's in somewhere. Here is also, for example, in the Yanomami territory here. And solutions also in the agroforest systems, so it goes on. Just the forested zona, that's the red one here. Land tenure is important here. If you're going to legalize old occupation, makes sense here. Because those people have been there for a long time. And you kind of close the frontier. Use the area that has been left behind, increase livestock productivity, lower carbon agriculture. When people are talking about infrastructure, here is important. Roads here is important. There is not important. So this is important because in Brazil, people look at the Amazon as something unique, both in terms of the problem and the problem solutions. And this creates a very confused dialogue for people that doesn't understand the reality in the Amazon region. Here is the big puzzle. Just to give the number, this white area, this is a complex map. The reality is even more complex. That's the most simple map that I can make it that you can understand. But okay, let's go a little bit here. Green are the protected areas. Okay, so both in terms of indigenous land and conservation unit. The good news is 40% is green, so it's protected. There are some military area here. It's also protected for other reasons. That rural settlement that I mentioned, the side of Germany, there's a split here, okay? Some are very into the forest zone. So you have to take care because the land reform area has been a rate of deforestation very high. Private, mostly Mato Grosso and the south. Then the white area, no allocated public forest. And that's the area that we should green, color as green, protected. That's part of the strategy. We know how to do. We did in the past. There's by the law, you have to do a technical study, you know how to do. And you have the consultation process. And who can sign the document? The president. So Lula actually can save, because if he decides to create this, he's by the side. He doesn't need the Congress approval. It's different for US. The law allows the president to do a discretionary, based on the consultation process and the technical, create protected areas by law, by his signature, without Congress approval. If the people decide to de-gazette the area, so the Congress have to approve, but to create just Lula signature. And he already mentioned about that. If becoming green, we are got to be, and we address the pink point here, that all of the discussion, because it's a little bit sensitive, because most of the, let's say, the land reform is supported by left progressive movements. They have to address this because it's let's say, it's a worse scenario, because you actually perpetuate poverty and increase forest degradation and destruction. So, as I answer yes. For final comments, 70%, around 2/3, about 70% of the lands in the Amazon regions belongs to the federal government in a way or another. Indigenous lands is running by FUNAI, federal agents. Most of the conservation units, it's a federal ones. Land reform area is a public land, federal public land. Most of the white territory that I mentioned, it's the federal government has hands on. So the question of land, the question of forest belong to the Lula desk. So he can save the Amazon and the planet if do this, and I think has a good chance to do.
Thank you. That was good to hear, Beto. Thank you for such a comprehensive, detailed, and probing, and and hopeful tone of your presentation. Matias.
Great. Thank you, Jean, for the invite, and great to meet you, Beto, for the first time. So, impossible job. I think this is the first time we had an event at the Brazil Lab, which was so optimistic and, reason for cheer. That's fantastic. So, Beto's theory, in a nutshell, goes like this. If you look at the economics of the Amazon and then you look at the demographics of the Amazon, everything points, with the exception of criminal rings, everything points in the direction of progress. All it takes is change the president, get Bolsonaro out of the way, bring Lula in, and then he can deliver good governance. So, without wanting to spoil your evening, of course, let me try and push back a little bit against some of the expectations. Because after all, if this was indeed the case, we would have seen good governance come to the Amazon big time last time Lula was around. And to be sure, as Beto showed, deforestation goes down. But it's under PT administrations that deforestation then begins to go up. So there's something about deforestation that goes beyond who is the president of Brazil. There's something about the politics of deforestation that makes it very intractable to curb the coming down of the forest. So my question is, can we think about what the core political dynamics are at the heart of the Amazon that make it so difficult to engender good governance in the long term? And I'm not questioning that Beto is absolutely right in the sense that now that there's a change of government, we are going to see deforestation come down. But my suspicion is that what we're going to see is low-hanging fruit. It's the easy bit. It's the reinforcing of IBAMA. It's the president signing the right documents. Is the coalitions in government not blocking progressive legislation. But there's something far more perverse about the politics of the Amazon, and that's the bit I worry about. And listening to Beto talk, there are 4 things that I wanted to very briefly go through. And I only have 7 minutes now, so I'm going to rush it. First of all is the electoral system. Brazil's electoral system ensures interest group dominance. This is a competitive democracy, open elections, transparent, no evidence of serious vote buying in Brazil, and yet the political system is profoundly unaccountable. People know who they vote for, but because our system is proportional representation with coalitions, people know who they vote for, but they do not know who they elect for Congress. So the Brazilian voter cannot possibly, 4 years down the line, punish their representatives who have not delivered good governance. Hence, you have a country that is relatively wealthy, that pours money into health and education, and has dismal performance in all policy areas, and that hasn't changed. Same goes for the environment. Of course, this electoral system means that land tenure becomes politicized. So studies by political scientists show that on the eve of the elections, deforestation goes up, and it goes up because the federal government, whoever is in charge, on the left or on the right, will dispense public lands in exchange for votes, all-type clientelism. And that gets those bits of land deforested. The second element is state capacity. And of course, we hear lots about IBAMA. And as Beto said, one of the good things about Brazil is that the state capacity is there. But how about the politics of state capacity? We know full well that IBAMA can only do its work if it can cooperate with not only the federal police, but also the state police. And state police are highly politicized in Brazil. When Marina Silva took office now as Minister of the Environment, she said that she found out that there were not only a few illegal airstrips in the Amazon, but there were 1,700 illegal airstrips in the Amazon in a region that is larger than Western Europe. So good luck with developing the state capacity to get rid of the illegal airstrips, which you need to bomb from the air. But the problem, she says, is that the minute you bomb one of these airstrips, give it 3 days, it's rebuilt. And how do you ensure that you can curb this if you don't have a system that responds to national command straight away? And because you need state police forces that respond to governors, not to the federal government, that's a tricky one. Beto mentioned the protected areas, and protected areas are incredibly important. All the statistics show that the minute you set up a protected area, deforestation goes down. But stats also show that protected areas are incredibly heterogeneous. Some work really well, some others work less well, and that's all to do with politics. It's to do with the local coalitions and the parties in the local coalitions, whether they're aligned to the federal government or whether they're disaligned with the federal government, and therefore they have the opposition of the federal government. One study shows that what presidents of Brazil do is create protection areas in strongholds of opposition parties as a way of punishing them. So there again, the politics of deforestation gets on the way of good governance in a big way. My third theme is public opinion. This is really worrying. I mean, studies show that in Brazil, there's no climate skepticism around the existence of climate change, and that's good news, different from the United States. And there is no climate skepticism around the human origins of climate change, which is also wonderful news. But when it comes to the severity of the consequences of climate change, then that polarizes society, right? Around 60% of Brazilians believe climate change to have severe consequences, but 40% don't. And among those who don't, resistance to climate policy is relatively high. There's no social mobilization beyond elite groups for climate action. There is no Greta Thunberg in Brazil mobilizing the vote. In fact, candidates that run on an environmental ticket in Brazil normally do fairly poorly. If there was a political system in which you should see lots of representation for green parties, is Brazil, because Brazil has a proportional representation system. It's not like the UK, where the first past the post. It's not a polarized system like America, where you only have two parties vying for power. In Brazil, you could have lots of Green Party representatives, and you don't. So that's a problem, because public opinion is not necessarily there. Now, one question is, will extreme weather events turn public opinion? Well, last week we had massive floods in Brazil, some of the biggest floods in many, many years. And how many press reports did you see framing the floods as a climate change problem? Carlos Nobre on television was the only person I could count. All the others framed the problem of floods as a problem of housing, as a problem of income distribution, but not as a problem of climate change. So again, public opinion, I'm not sure is there. And then finally, and with this I promise to shut up, it's the international system. John Kerry was in Brazil yesterday and the day before. So what's the story of the international system? Problem is the international system actively contributes to high deforestation in Brazil. First of all, because consumers keep consuming products from deforested land. When the European Union had the idea of imposing a moratorium on soy produced in the Amazon, what soy producers did was move their production from the Amazon to the Cerrado, spreading the range of environmental destruction. The fact is that because the United States, the European Union, and China cannot agree on a common policy for the import of high carbon footprint commodities from Brazil, Brazil gets away with exporting stuff that is very high in carbon emissions, and I don't think we're seeing any move in the opposite direction now, in particular now that China and the United States are breaking the WTO apart. Very little progress on that front, I think. The other issue is, of course, the lack of money. If Brazil is going to do all the changes that Beto rightly points out need to be done, then probably there will need to be some form of compensation. As you see here in the United States, where federal funds are compensating communities in coal areas, when you help pay for the transition to move people away from high carbon footprint economic activity to a different story, Brazil will need the money. And the money is simply not there. John Kerry couldn't offer. They made an offer of $50 million for a problem that experts assume will take about $100 billion in 80 years. And finally, there's the issue of crime. We framed crime as a domestic problem, mostly, and that's Ibama and the federal police and the state police fighting criminals inside Brazil. But the problem is that criminality in the Amazon is very much a transnational problem. Now, when was the last time a country in Latin America tried to deal with criminality in the Amazon? That's Colombia. And it took Colombia, Plan Colombia, which meant a massive investment from the United States in developing repressive capacity in Colombia at an enormous cost for human rights in Colombia, with vast consequences. Of course, we now celebrate that Colombia is in peace, but at what cost and over what time frame? How long will it take Brazil to fight criminal rings? And remember, these are not criminal rings that simply operate in the shadows. These are criminal rings that finance political campaigns, that have representatives in local office, at the state level and at the federal level. So managing to put together a pro-climate coalition is not going to be trivial. And I think this helps explain the paradox. The paradox is, why on earth a biome in which demographics and economics point in the direction of low deforestation ends up having high deforestation rates? Isn't that because there's something at the level of politics that gets on the way? And my question is to you, Beto, what's the coalition that is needed to break these anti-climate coalitions, if you want, that integrate criminal rings, private activity, state actors, to try and turn things around? Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe, yeah, aqui mesmo?
Yes.
Okay. Good comments. And I put 5 elements of your that you mentioned, try to address. The first that I think, if we want to pick up one key issue, is the land tenure issue. There is a remarkable piece published 20 years ago by a friend of ours called Robert Schneider from the World Bank, called he explained a little bit why deforestation happened in the Amazon region, and why happened in a way that left behind degraded land. Just why the frontier is moving. The frontier is moving because you have a abundance of free land. And you have to close the frontier by protected areas. The land tenure is it's not a silver bullet, but I don't believe in silver bullet, but that's the most effective way to address such complex issue that we can look around. And that basically this idea from Bob Schneider, and we apply when the political opportunity arrive, and the created of protected areas and, let's say, red zones, that was very effective. And I feel very effective. So it's let's say, the most cost-effective policy that we can do in a short run to reduce deforestation, while other critical issues that you mentioned is still there. Then I think its issues relate to get out, protect all the public forests or the public lands that are available. We know exactly where they are, and we know how to do. And that's why I think that the Lula decree in a short run is a very powerful measure. The questions of, as you create protected areas, you have in some areas, you have to what we call consolidated. Because sometimes you create a protected area in a red zone, and you have to, what you call, if there is maybe some problems behind, because there are some people that claims the land, and you have to deal with. But that's not the majority of the deforestation. Deforestation right now, in the last 5 years, almost 50% of deforestation is actually happening in areas that are not protected. They actually forest public forests. So those forests that we need to protect it, That was the problem there. That shows very clear what's the game is playing. The game is to play to take the land.
Why have they not been protected yet, you think?
There was, I think, the two reasons. One is during Dilma Rousseff moment, his president, I think Dilma doesn't understand the Amazon region and doesn't understand that the job should be completed. And we can discuss more about that. And then we come up with the political crisis. And then you have Temer and Bolsonaro. And the Bolsonaro was completely the opposite of all the presidents that came after the democracy process in Brazil gets to all the presidents in Brazil. Different political affiliations. But those presidents from Sarney up through Collor, all in a sense was, I would put it this way, green oriented. So they always try to advance the idea of fighting deforestation, protected, etc. Fernando Henrique was the moment that we create a lot of indigenous reserves. So for other reasons, the protected areas issue, the public opinion element, but it's probably, I don't think Brazil has, if you go to the polls, actually the polls show up, people are concerned about the Amazonia region. It's 94% if you go to the, but we don't have a political constituency that actually vote in terms of the green. I completely agree with you. And we don't have to wait to do this, because if you want to wait 10 years to have the political constituency to be able to save the Amazon, it's going to be too late. And the element of international, we can look in a different perspective. But some data here and more empirical evidence. First of all, most of the product that produced in the Amazon does not go to international market. Timber, 90% goes to domestic market and declining. Timber production is declined for a market reason, for technological reasons. Cattle, meat, actually mostly goes to domestic market. Brazil is not a big player in terms of meat production from the Amazon region. They are from the other parts. Soybean, yes, but soybean is more than savanna and cerrado. There is a agricultural limitation for growing soybean in a rainfall regime. The area that rains about 3,000 millimeters per year is impossible to do a soybean in a competitive way. So in a sense, forest protects forest, because soybean, it's hard for soybean to advance on the more humid zone. Soybean is actually on the borders of the forest. They're actually in the more dry zone. So what we exported actually is mineral, but not gold mining. Gold mining is a completely different business. Brazilian Amazon has a wonderful iron and aluminum deposit, the richest in the planet. So those companies that have fixed assets there, a company that has like Vale and others, I would say they are allies of this. They are concerned about the same problems that we are, because they are going to be there for the next 100 years. They fix assets, they cannot move, and they are pressured by the shareholders, by investors, to address the problems surrounding its operations. So what we export mostly actually is iron, but I think in the international perspective works in a different direction. I think there's a lot of pressure right now, and the last 4 years, I remember when 2019, when the forest fire was off control, and that's people start to talking about boycott Brazil. And they start in a small pace with the leather industry, couro. What the businesses was affected was in Rio Grande do Sul, miles, 3,000 miles from the Amazonia. Doesn't care if you are in the Amazonia or you are out of the Amazon. You are Brazil. You are responsible. Then some people on the private sector start to be worried about, and others follow. And the pressure for stopping deforestation has increased. The difference from first Lula term as a president, when Lula was first-time president, the issue of climate change was not so dramatic as now. It's evident now that if you lose the Amazon, we lose the battle against climate change. So that was put a lot of pressures in Brazil. And the pressure that we never face as we have facing now. And of course, there is going to be political battle, as we can imagine. But I think I'm a little bit optimistic because we have so much land open up. Most of the, I'd say, the agribusiness are concerned about deforestation. The governor of Mato Grosso, the soybean governor of Mato Grosso. The Mato Grosso is the most, I would say, probably the red state in the US, maybe Utah, something like that. That's the type of, the governors came back from Egypt and say, we need to end deforestation. Legal or illegal, doesn't care about, because the world wants, and we have to address this issue. This is a guy that's on the right spectrum of the conversation. I think my point is the international channel operates right now in the direction of pressure us. On the crimes element, that's I fully agree with you. It's transnational. It's something that we don't have in the past as a big problem. It's widespread. That's impact a lot of young folks, because if people don't have jobs, they actually go for something else. They go to the criminality. So that's why I think a policy to fight deforestation include addressing the social issues of the young folks, the training elements, and those. The final comments about criminality is that's not clear. It might be another conversation. So we did a very interesting pieces on Amazonia 2030 about where the criminality is associated with environmental issues. Of course, we have criminality when we have gold mining. Gold mining is a big puzzle, is a big problem that we have to address. We have illegal logging, illegal gold mining, and land grabbing. If those three layers combined, criminality is very high. So what's the easiest to address? First, start with gold mining, because gold mining looks very powerful, but in the end of the day, there is a rule if the central bank can do about that can change the game of the gold mining. Gold mining is operating in Brazil completely out of let's say, tax collection system. It's something very strange that's now to be addressing right now. Land grabber issue, as I mentioned. So there's issues that we can address that actually reduce the level of criminality that's associated with environmental problems. Because in the cities where the criminality is high, it's not affect forests, it's affect people. It's affect people that live in the cities. So this criminality has to be like in some way separated. Curiosity about Colombia case is the criminality there that was terrible. But in some aspect, the criminality actually protect the forest. Because the people that operate in the criminality with drug cartel, the forest cover actually protect them. So it's too much. It's a very complex issue, but I think they are not, again, the Lula desk, I don't think the criminality will be the enemy for him to sign up the document that I mentioned. Of course, I oversimplify the issue to create this debate. But I think for each question that you raised, that's completely right, and the whole issue of public representation, like say the political field. Final comments. It's 2019 here. We got the first leapfrogging. We invite the governor of Pará. Pará is it's a key state. Now it's bigger than Peru, where most of the problems happen. There's a new governor elected, supported by a lot of people, like from the timber sector. Thing. He was not progressive. He was not to be green guy, but he came here. He was in some way political smart enough to understand where the wave is driving. He's now a champion of protection in the Amazon. I'm not sure that, just say, he has been around. He was with King Charles Second, he was in Davos, he was in COP, and the governors' coalition, for different reasons, think that's to be doing for business and for developing the region, addressing because the region is in a pool I would call perfect storm right now. We got the social indicators, the worst in Brazil. Economics, terrible in terms of Brazil economy is growing relative. Brazil has I'd say very low level of GDP, and all in terms of economic is not doing well for the last 20 years, with some moments. The Amazon is even worse. The productivity is even worse. So, and the environmental is terrible. To me, that's enough. Because if you are governor there, if you are mayor, you're facing this problem every day. So the question is, we got to get out of the deforestation economy that drives us to this problem today. The transition requires the last point that you mentioned about funds. The funds is not going on to compensate Brazil, but it needs to funds in terms of find alternative for developing the region. And the alternative in some aspects maybe is counterintuitive. Maybe it's going to focus on cities. Maybe focus on the reforestation. So the Amazonia 2030 initiative brings us life in terms of what should be done for the real leapfrogging. It's out of the box, most of the solutions. But anyway, I stop it here. Wonderful.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Beto, and thank you for this provocative and insightful comments, Matias. Let's open and collect a series of questions, like a little bundle. Yeah, Pedro.
Yeah,
Carlos.
I mean, so good to have you again here, Beto. I just wanted to mention very briefly something about the rhetoric, about the way you present things. I mean, it's so clearly that we're talking. It's so clear that we're talking about the future of the Earth that all of a sudden we feel we are on the same boat. So I congratulate you. I praise you for that. But I have two quick questions and one comment, very briefly. One is trying to address João's provocation about. I mean, with this question, can Lula save the Amazon? You used a very important, interesting sentence that has been used in Brazil, was used in Brazil, especially during the campaign, which is Brazil is back. I know you used in a different way. You were saying, I mean, Brazil is back in a certain way, wrong way of dealing with the environmental issue. But I wanted to hear from you about this idea that Brazil is back, and this has to do with your conversation with Matias, because it seems that Lula 3 is completely different from Lula 1 and 2 because of this international scenario. It's certainly completely different from Dilma 1 and 1.5, so to speak, because there is something about not going back to a developmentalist model. So I wanted to hear more about that. And also, the second question has to do with something we heard from Carolina Leves when she was discussing Eduardo Neves' presentation here a couple of weeks ago, when they mentioned something that was mind-blowing. I mean, the fact that they wanted somehow to find more and more archaeological sites throughout the Amazon, because this way they could sort of stop the advance of this developmentalist enterprise, because all of a sudden if you find an archaeological site, you need to stop everything and just focus on it as it is, right? And this has to do with a certain idea of this green developmentalism, if we can call it this way, because there is something here about the Arminio Fraga model of not developing or not touching the Amazon, not touching the forest, and only developing the cities. I mean, it may sound weird, strange, counterintuitive, but there is something about the way we treat and deal and think about the Amazon as an untouched or a place not to be touched that maybe is not as romantic, as impossible to conceive as we've been thinking. In other words, maybe what literature, what poetry, what the imaginary can create about a way of thinking about the Amazon as a space not to be completely touched is interesting here. So, and that's, I guess, the political side of the poetics of the Amazon, to go back to something we've been discussing and we discussed here in the Brazil Lab a while ago. But in both cases, the Amazon will be saved by the ongoing creation of a narrative about what Amazonia is. I mean, and how to create basically this environment protecting narrative is something that I think should bring together, as it does, humanists and scientists, and that's what we've been trying to do here. I wanted to hear you about that, and I'm also thinking, Beto, about how to create this environment protecting narrative with the rise of the evangelicals, and since there is, I mean, whose ethics has to do, in a nutshell, has to do with an entrepreneurial spirit, right? I mean, so how not to touch with this, with God telling you that you should touch this land because this land has been made for man to deal with it. And just one quick note and correction, because and trying to go against Matias' attempt at really spoiling our afternoon.
Or
We can drink
it wasn't an attempt.
It was.
It was.
Right? John Kerry's offer is open. Actually, the 50 millions were offered by Biden when Lula visited Biden a couple of weeks ago. John Kerry's visit yesterday or the day before yesterday is totally open. Obviously, we won't get to the 100 billion, but what I'm trying to say is not just about numbers or figures, but there is something about the international scenario, the internationalization of Amazonia that is very much at the core of Lula's rhetoric at this point, that that should be something we should be considering. I'm sorry,
No, it's great.
Wonderful. No, it's
Maybe can I try to address, because he mentioned some.
Yes, go.
Okay, brief.
1 minute.
We start with.
Then we will start to exercise the art of conversation.
I apologize for the simplification of my answers, but the issue of forests and cities, the point for me is that we don't have to push for, say, extract timber from the forest to create revenue and jobs in the forest for people that are not indigenous, because we are finding that's the way we have plenty of opportunity to do this in other sides. But I fully agree that there are the indigenous and people that living with the forest and manage the forest. This is a cultural forest that has been created in part by human, let's say, the last 15,000 years. So it's completely. The whole aspect of ecological site is the use of LiDAR technology to mapping. That was fantastic. Eduardo Neves is involved and Tasso is involved. So definitely helps to sign even soon as we get more evidence side. And I think the whole aspect of the narrative, the cultural dimensions, that this actually is Egypt has pyramids, and we have the forest. That's our treasure. That's something unique that actually is a cultural and an ecological combination of this forest. Has been around for 10 million years, at least the Amazon forest. So but the country doesn't understand this. There was no, the forest represent right now an option in terms of utilitarian approach. I mean, we have to protect because the planet asks us to do this, and we have to have reasons to protect the forest for not because the economic or other issues. So I fully agree, and I think Lula 3, different from others, Lula 1 and 2. I think I mentioned one aspect, but I think the nature-based solutions. And that's the way we are going to. We are in a transition moment. For the first time, Brazil has the potential to contribute for the planet. Brazil never been very important in terms of addressing geopolitical crisis at the global level. We are a relative small country in terms of geopolitical power, but we are now asking, Planet asks us to do a role that it's important. Until we find a way to reduce the emissions and transitional energy and find a way to capture carbon more efficient than the photosynthesis. I hope we can address this, but probably in the next 20 years we need forests. And I think Lula understands this very, very clear. And that's put Brazil diplomacy in a high level. Brazil diplomacy, Brazil have to sell the idea of nature-based solution as a key element of the Lula 3. Lula 3 is now, Lula 1 and 2 was dealing with the social issue that was still important and has been recognized worldwide because of the reduction of poverty and the cash transfer program. Right now, Lula understands that the world wants him to be a leader of conservation in Brazil because the past lessons, Brazil can play this role. And that's and you can see the creation of the Itamaraty, branching of Itamaraty, the State Department, a branch of Diplomática that is going to, the climate is on the top. If you see positions in the government right now, always is connected with this. And Brazil now could be the head of G20 start September, and probably is a moment to understand if Brazil is going to play this role. I hope it will be, and that the countries actually put on the table a nature-based solution approach where money transfer funds is a part of this, but it needs more than that. That's the, let's say, the opportunity that arrived that different from 2004. 2004, Lula was not convinced. It was Marina agenda. And the Lula, okay, let's do it. But now, Lula is speaking about this more and more frequently as I think, in a sense, Amazonia, it might save Lula term. Because if Lula it's in some way, it's a protector of the Amazon. And the Amazon is important for the planet. It's hard to be, Lula in some sense, it's kind of connected. The future of the Amazon is actually the future of Lula term, and in my opinion.
Can Amazon save Lula?
Lula, yeah, the Amazon can save Lula. That's
Okay,
completely.
wonderful. I like the play of words and incredible ideas, and Carlos, Aparecida, Matias, art of condensation, to the point.
Thank you very much for both of you. It was very interesting. Beto, I would love to hear a little bit on climate change. I mean, especially in the plural tipping points in the Amazon. I work in southern Amazonian periphery and in Pará, two highly deforested areas. And for me, it's clear that the tipping point is already there. We have drier seasons, long dry seasons, more wildfires, increasing temperature, it's really, it has changed in the last 20 years. It's not the same situation as in 2002. So how should we deal with that? Because it's just not a question of restoration and regeneration. If it is, it has to be done quickly because it's a tipping point. So and that that's the question.
Okay. Aparecida?
Hi, I'm Aparecida. I'm an anthropologist. I work in Brazil and among indigenous people. And I think that point that Pedro touched, and it was about the presence of missionaries and evangelical missions in Amazonia. I think it's something for you, I mean, Amazon and people who do wide models to think about, because it's not just about entrepreneurship, something like that, but also about passivity. Because what I've learned working among the indigenous people, the Wari, is that they became passive beings. Like they do not, they think they have to share their land with invaders because everyone is a child of God, etc. So there is a lot, and it's a kind of molecular spreading, something almost invisible in a way. But missionaries, they are everywhere. And what is happening is that they are allowing non-indigenous people to get into indigenous land and make their homes and their gardens, etc. So it's happening more and more. And I think it has an effect, a global effect.
Yes. Matias?
Let me ask you this. You said that when we look at the economics of the Amazon, meat production is not the driver of deforestation, and soy production is not the driver of deforestation. You mentioned that mining is a problem, but surely there must be something more, right? What's driving the fast-paced deforestation at the heart of the forest? What's the economic driver of this thing? It's what's not clear to me from your vision.
Okay.
And there is this sequence of grabbing land, which, logging, fire, cattle. So there is a system, and it's spread on in a certain temporality.
Okay. Start with
Get another round.
Yeah, start with the Matias questions about what's driving deforestation. What I said about the meat is most of the meat that actually produced in the region goes to domestic market.
Oh, okay.
That means they are not the transactional international market. They are actually pressure for products from the Amazon. Amazonia is not a place that we expected to produce, let's say, grains a lot, or meat or timber. Soybean has actually an importance, mostly in terms of Cerrado that is inside the Amazonia and Cerrado outside. But less than 10% of the area has been clear cut, actually is allocated for soybean. Soybean, and I would say 80% in some way, that I put in this kind of, in some way allocated for meat production. But that, when you go down, you travel around the region, what we can see is empty land. We can drive miles and miles without seeing any cattle. So what's driving the economics is land grabbing. Is actually the land, if I have, what's the best economics? The people come to the Amazonia, invade the public forest, pay nothing, extract timber, sell the timber, put cattle, and later on, sell this land. We pay nothing. So it's actually the lack. That's the dynamic. We don't need to clear cut in terms of to increase agricultural production. The deforestation does not provide revenues and jobs that you can think that we destroy, but we create now wealth as a return. And that's why I mentioned about the Hope Schneider paper, because he described very clear. If you are not artificially, the land should be artificially scarced. I mentioned in the beginning, the area of the Brazilian Amazon is bigger than India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Burma, and Vietnam combined. For 28 million people, just less than 2% of the people that lives in subcontinent India. What's driving? That's the land is open for grab. Not all, but what is available right now, it's grab. And when you look at the data, it's very clear where the deforestation happened. The deforestation happened exactly where the lands are not protected. Or when the Bolsonaro say, we want to de-gazette it, we want to get out of the demarcation, then the people start to evade it because they expected the law is going to be changed. There was a game around the land grabbing. So the land grab is the issue. And the solutions in some way is the land tenure, but the land tenure in a way that government protect the lands that belongs to the public. The second element for the evangelicals' role, and I fully agree, there is an initiative that running in parallel of our initiative that called Interfaith Initiative. It is very important. And I think evangelicals are very, let's say, complex microcosmos of faith and religions. Then we never actually, we never have, in Brazil at least, an initiative to try to create a dialogue with those evangelicals. So there are initiatives right now. The Carlos Vicente that works with Marina Silva, he's head. He's doing especially with young pastors, pastors, young folk. That's the idea of narrative about nature. It's belong to us to protect this nature, because this nature is part of it's something secret, sagrado. But right now, the evangelicals operate in most of cases in a harm way in terms of, as you mentioned, I fully agree. But the way to move out is both in terms of find a dialogue and think about to influence those sectors that are important. And there was a very interesting analysis done by this group that showed the evangelicals are very concerned, especially the women, are very concerned about the destruction because they think about the issue of water, food security, and so they are not so, they are more complex as you approach. And I think there are some hopeful that this initiative can open some bridge. The tipping point, you were absolutely right. We expected that deforestation actually caused a tipping point. Nobody knows exactly what's the tipping point. We have already 21% of the forest has been clear cut. 81% is still forest cover, but there's a lot of degradation there. And the Luciana Gatti, that remarkable paper showed that in part of the Amazon, the tipping point is actually happening. You can see. That was something that you can add as a reason to end deforestation, because we, on one hand, and the tipping point issue is a issue, the tipping point issue, and rios voadores, the flying rivers, was the most effective piece of narrative that convinced people in Brazil that something happened in the Amazon region. I remember Simone Tebet, a candidate for president. I have a chance by Amazonia 2030 initiative to talk with all the candidates and the pre-candidates about the Amazonia. Doria, all these guys. We talk before the election about what they know about the Amazonia, what they doesn't know in terms of literacy about basics. And I remember during the debate with Lula, Simone Tebet raised the question of tipping point. About the refined river, she was concerned about Mato Grosso, Mato Grosso do Sul, that less rain comes, and we don't have a second crops harvesting. Something that capture the agriculture sector because they can see that's happening. And of course, it's create another existential crisis in front of us. So that's another reason to us to speed up Lula pen.
I think you make it positive, but it's so good.
Okay. so let's collect a final, very condensed round of questions, and both to Beto and to Matias, and then we'll wrap up with a few comments from them. Okay, Adriana?
Okay, well, thank you so much. So I have a question about the economic incentives, the central role of the urban, and then also kind of this new infrastructure that you're proposing, the digital, that is supposed to get people into cities or make them feel like they don't need to touch the trees anymore because they have something better to do. So on the one hand, it's just a question about, you mentioned $10 per ton of carbon. Is that sort of the ideal price that can tip this deforestation economy into a 3.0 nature-based economy? And then, like, who's doing the coordination between the economic incentives, the pricing, and then the digital infrastructure? I mean, who's, like, what institutions are involved to sort of push this into the sort of 3.0 that you've been talking about?
Great. Yes, yeah. Vinicius?
Yes, I have two questions. Well, first of all, thank you for this presentation, and I was particularly captured by two things. The urban solution, so to speak, and the graph that you showed on the economic distribution, mostly of jobs now, or how the economic structure of the Amazon looks like right now. So I have two questions. The first one is about this idea of developing cities, because then we have a problem here, because in some time we're gonna have urban density, and we're gonna have urban issues in addition to other issues that may be around. At the same time, you're gonna make smaller municipalities emptier. So what does that change in the politics, in the local politics of Amazonia? And what does that change when if we like decades from now are talking about harder urban issues in Belém or in Manaus. So that's the first question about the urban solution. And the second very quick question about the service sector. This is a sector that thrives where the labor force is cheap, where people have money to spend on services, and in that sense, it kind of makes sense to be stronger in cities. But also we have to consider that many times they depend on other strong economic activities around. So if we look at mining towns in Brazil, normally they generate jobs, but around them there is a thriving service sector that depends on those jobs. My question is, how much of the service sector nowadays in Amazonia depends on illegal activities? So how many of the jobs are indirectly generated and maintained by human trafficking, animal trafficking, drug trafficking? We can go on and on, land grabbing, illegal mining, etc.
Okay.
Is that your name?
Devin. Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful presentation and conversation. I think first just sort of outlining some of the opportunities and constraints of the region, and then this conversation about some of the incentives, perverse incentives that sort of block us from making progress. It's really revealing to have this sort of domestic picture of what's happening, and I'm thinking about it from a comparative perspective. So when I first came in thinking about, you know, the older conversation of South-South relationships and the role that Brazil was going to play when that was sort of a dominant idea or paradigm, and now with Lula coming back, there's another opportunity to make these kinds of linkages. So in the beginning, we had the provocation, can he save the Amazon, and the idea of being a green superpower. So as I'm listening to sort of the list of constraints, I'm thinking about how does this play out in other places, and particularly thinking about the Congo basin, which has the second largest rainforest in the world, and is dealing with very similar issues when it comes to deforestation, mining, et cetera. So that got me thinking about this idea of internationalization of the Amazon, not just from the standpoint of the Amazon in terms of its role in larger geopolitics, but also what lessons can we take? Rather than thinking about it as a green superpower, maybe sort of thinking of this idea of a pro-climate coalition, but not just domestic, international. And the conversation or the response, looking at sort of governance ideas, can we move to a place where we're thinking more about green governance? And so I think there's a huge opportunity there, and there were a couple of themes that came out that I'd love to hear you both address. One was the role of continuity, which came up in the presentation, the importance of having, bureaucrats at a level that are able to sort of manage these processes, regardless of who's, taking political control. This sort of bushwashing back and forth between more progressive and regressive regimes. We've had it here in the United States. We've seen it in Brazil as well. So this is a huge source of anxiety for people that are very interested in trying to protect the climate. Then the issue of land regimes I thought was really interesting. And this is a tension that is, a huge one in the sub-Saharan African context. And there's a tension there between defining and enforcing these sort of protective regimes, especially when it's the state doing it, and then protecting indigenous communities. Indigenous communities are not static; they move, they're dynamic. They have a certain heterogeneity, and I think that that's something that is a bit tricky to sort of nail down. And then I thought this sort of conversation about resource investments was huge. And there's a tension here as well, I think we've thought about this a lot when it comes to extraction, so mining, deforestation, et cetera, but we haven't thought about it as much when it comes to preservation. So the example in the Congo is that they have huge peatlands. So the question is actually, how do you keep people from not touching resources as opposed to extraction? And when you have both of these types of activities happening in a region, it's incredibly complicated to devise like a governance system that can sort of manage this kind of thing. So, and then the last point I thought, which was really important, is alternatives for development, AKA alternatives for transformation. So whether that's economic transformation, this came up in the conversation about cities and trying to create economic opportunities away from this area. And then seeing whether or not there's also opportunities for social transformation. So you brought up a lot of education statistics. I don't know if health statistics also in the region are a particular issue. But to me, this is sort of mapping like a way to think about green governance, which I think would be really interesting. And then lastly, obviously Brazil would be the one taking the lead, but I do think there's a tremendous opportunity after COP27 with the role of small island nations rising, with the Bridgetown Initiative led by Mia Motley from Barbados, and other entities that really haven't had this type of position on the world stage, really rethinking the conversation about climate finance, these types of transfers that could potentially help save both rainforests as well as deal with sea level rises. That's really the issue for the small island nation. So it's a really it's an exciting, opportune moment, and I'm really excited to think about how we might be able to map out new forms of governance that address these issues.
It's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Catalina?
Wow, I have many questions.
Okay,
Yeah.
but I want to throw in a question, but we are collecting to be continued. Okay,
Exercise condescension, please.
Okay, yeah. So it was very interesting. I felt a certain tension, a creative tension, when you both in the initial exchange in ideas of the political that you have, and I understand. And I can share that sense, okay, a certain electoral form of politics, right? A certain temporality of the electoral politics, what it does in terms of priority, allocation, Beto, you seem to have to endorse or to think of a different kind of the political. You said, when the political moment emerges. The political almost as a window of opportunity, and then you have to have tools available to seize that, right? And then you instantiate a new field. Right? But both of you seem to be concerned with systems at the same time. But the kind of systemic reform that seems to underline your idea of the political, then we are with you. That's lost. Because to make a political reform and then save the Amazon, it's impossible. Right? You seem to be suggesting a different idea of the political, and then also a different idea of the systemic that might be necessary to sustain this window of opportunity that might be here now, right? So anyway, I just thought of there are different ideas of the political and the systemic at play in the conversation here.
Okay. No, I will start with that. Of course, for the conversation aspects, we will oversimplify some elements of now the discussions, but I think we have a short period of time to save the Amazon. The tipping point issues was raised, the emergence of climate change. So we have this 4 years of government to change the direction of deforestation, protecting, and it's going to do with a lot of political shock. There will be a lot of crises, but that should be done. That's the way, and I think there is a lot of reasons why it's possible. But of course, some obstacles ahead. But I think the reasons are more. Right now, I think the political will, that the top leadership of the countries, I have a chance to talk with people of the Supreme Court, and we can understand now, they see this is something that have to be addressed. The questions of South-South, and I think absolutely critical, again, nature-based solution, it depends on the equator line, depends on the tropical regions, both in terms of climate. But another crisis that is looming is the biodiversity crisis. So absolutely, I think that you have to think about the tropical countries get together, and Brazil has an important role to make. Even mention, I don't have to mention that there's a lot of other Amazonian countries, not only Brazil. Brazil is big, but there was a Peru, was a Bolivia, and other countries. They started actually the Brazil diplomatic leadership are looking. First, we start with a conversation with the neighbors and the Amazonia region. No, not 8 countries, including France, because there's a French Guyana border of Brazil. So, and then you have Africa with another different dynamic, and Southeast Asia. That was the issue of population. Southeast Asia is completely different from the Amazon region. So that was maybe different issues, but they holds the solutions for the climate transition, because they hold forests, they have carbon storage and the capacity to capture carbon. This piece that was done by 2 years ago on the Time magazine, it's about, they took the 7,000 companies that have a pledge of carbon neutral, and the amount of carbon they have to reduce to achieve that, including big companies, Google and others, it's two-thirds they can do by change the energy, technology, but at least 1/3 they have to depend on offset. They have to depend basically to capture carbon. If right now the most effective way to capture carbon is planting trees, the amount of land that needs to do is the size of India, split in the planet. Okay? So again, not only because holds carbon on the standing forest, but to capture carbon, force back, is another opportunity for countries. Of course, going to be varies among the tropical countries, but absolutely. And I think there was a lot of lessons learned in terms of transfer technology, find against illegal international crime, and other aspects that I think it's absolutely critical. On the urban solutions and the questions of sector, I think the big picture is there are relative few jobs proportional that link it to the criminality. Look at behind from different perspective. If you go to the amount of jobs that actually generated by timber extraction, it's a fraction of the people that are actually employed. And gold mining is important, but the same size is important in Yanomami because it's 20,000 gold miners. But we're talking about 10 million people that actually are on the job market. So it's a relatively small fraction that people that either are doing directly operation that destroy the nature, it's gold mining, and people that operate chainsaw and stuff like that, and then indirectly. And some counties it might be. When we have the more detailed data about this, so I did just bring back. But the answer is we don't have worry because as we fight in deforestation, you are not creating harm for jobs. We have a good chance to create more jobs in another direction. Urban solutions, of course, it's more complex, but I think people moving. There is a trend of people moving to cities, even in big cities in the Amazon. That's the trend. What's left in let's say, the forest zone and the rural areas is relatively sparsely populated. They have to find another ways. One initiative that Tasso and I'm involved, and others, we located with indigenous leadership and African Brazilians movement and extractivism. We have 5,000 villages in the Brazilian Amazon. Less than 1% has internet. Those land grabbers, illegal loggers, and gold miners have internet. Those people that defend forests have no internet. So we are in a process right now to provide a broadband internet there. And there was a project with the new government, there was a good chance. So infrastructure for people that lives in remote areas is critical. Right now, there's a lot of new technology come up in terms of provide internet in remote areas with solar panel to provide energy for them to do. So I think I'm not saying that the urban issue is going to solve soon. I'm trying to avoid the tipping point and do the job that we have to do in terms of protection. There's a lot of work to do in cities in the Amazon regions. That's terrible cities in terms of traffic, congestion, mobility, health. There was a tremendous agenda. But the good thing is if Brazil decides to do something on the social, Brazil has a lot of good experience of address social issues, especially on the Bolsa Familia, but it needs to think about this in terms of the Amazonian cities. But the Amazonian cities, most of the debate is out of the debate. People think the Amazon doesn't look at cities, and cities actually is probably the key element of solution in terms of find alternative for people. The economics, there is a paper right now under the leadership of José Alessandro Sheikman. He was a professor here. Now he's Columbia University professor with Hans Larsen, is an economic Nobel Economic Prize, and Juliano. The point that we can change the game of the land grabbing economy that drives deforestation with an economy that's actually value forests, let's say in the perspective of the because the perspective of the land grabbers, the best business is land grabbing. But the perspective of the country, The price is around $15 a ton. The number that I mentioned here is the exercise done by Leafy Coalition. About, if you put $10 per ton, you generate $18 billion in terms of reduction of deforestation. But if you get the price of carbon about $15, then you start to change the game. It's basically, we start to look at cattle production to be a tree production. You change the way you look at the economy. The governors is going to change the way the economy, and then people are going to move as the price getting higher, because the level of productivity in the cattle sector is so low. It's basically, just to give a number, $40 per hectare per year. That's what they get as a gross revenue for one piece of land. So think about $10, $15 a carbon and a forest that holds about 100 tons. It's much more in terms of course, there's a potential market. This market is not yet. They are not transfer payments for environmental stuff at this level that we can change the game. But in the end of the day, we need it. We should have this. But the number is about 15. The final comments is about, I think Adriana mentioned, I forgot something about, you mentioned about the meat, soybean. I think you addressed already.
Yeah.
There is some other questions that I...
Matias, let's dig deep and find some hope there.
Yeah.
For us to end here on a...
This is a game. We have to play different.
Thank you for staying, guys. We will see it. We are witnessing a historic moment here.
Yeah.
Let me put it this way. Here's my hopeful thing on the basis of what you said. If we look at the last 40 years in the Amazon, we can conclude, I think, that Brazil is addicted to bad governance, with a very small exception during the first and second Lula administrations, right? And I agree entirely with you that in order to break the addiction to bad governance, something needs to happen which you called a shock. And I agree with you. It has to be a shock. The question is, where does the shock come from? It could be a new president that comes and he believes that now he can change things and, save himself in the process. Could be one shock. Another shock could be the international system punishing and increasing costs so that it breaks the bad governance. My fear is that bad governance is so ingrained that to break that system, it's going to take a long time, because Brazil is addicted to bad governance well beyond the Amazon. I mean, it's across areas. So the optimistic side is...
Bring it on.
Maybe this is the right time for an external shock that integrates political leadership on the part of Lula and then an international system that wants to see Brazil progress. Now, I'm not going to give you the results of the survey experiment we ran on how public opinion in Brazil responds to foreign climate criticism, because that would kill the optimism. But there is room for optimism there. And I agree with you, if there is a time in which these things could be aligned, it's now. So let's hope for the best.
Let's seize the time. Beto, Matias, thank you.